This is lecture 64 in the ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018 version, which will be out next year. And I just want to start out with a few comments. Today we're talking about Micronesia, and it's a case of evolution from primitive communism to the slave stage. And we're also going to try a new kind of cinematography. We've been making this series for 3 years now. We have 120 odd videos, and when we started out it was just me with a couple pages of paper, and the camera was focused on me. Today we're going to go to a slightly more high-tech version of an electronic screen with a map and so on. It'll show you one of the things that you really need to have, and that is perspective on where Micronesia, Polynesia, Melanesia, Australia, and New Zealand are with respect to South America and to the world for that matter. And then later, as we proceed through this lecture, we're going to stop and take a close look at the Federated States of Micronesia, which is just one of the 5 independent countries in the Micronesian area. But it's important to us for a particular reason, and that is 2 class-divided, state-organized kingdoms evolved in the Micronesian area, and they are in the MFS, or FSM, I should say, the Federated States of Micronesia. So with those comments, I'm going to go ahead and start our discussion of Micronesia from primitive communism to the slave stage with our electronic screen. We're going to start out by revisiting our definitions, and so that you can visualize them on the screen. Micronesia as a culture area is one of the 3 island culture areas of Oceania, comprising thousands of small islands in the western Pacific Ocean. It has a shared cultural history with the other 2 island regions, Melanesia to the south, which we've already discussed, and Polynesia to the east, which we will go to next. And we've already gone through New Zealand and Australia. And you can see those, well, you can see that New Zealand forms the southwestern corner of the Polynesian Triangle. Now in this presentation I include the continent of Australia and the islands of New Zealand as separate parts of Oceania. Now this Oceania ecozone has a mainly tropical marine climate, with the exception of South Australia and South New Zealand, where winter cold is reminiscent of modern latitudes, and of course with the exception of alpine and subalpine elevations, of which there aren't many in Australia, but there are quite a few in New Zealand. Now Micronesia itself is divided politically among 5 sovereign independent nations, namely the Federated States of Micronesia, FSM we'll be calling it in this presentation, Palau, Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, and there are 3 U.S. territories in its northern expanse. They are the Northern Mariana Islands, Guam, and Wake Island. The Federated States of Micronesia, FSM, is called Micronesia for short, but you should not confuse that with the overall region as we're using it anthropologically in this presentation. Micronesia has a prehistoric past that began several millennia ago with the primitive communism of tribal maritime adapted agriculturalists. These evolved into simple and then advanced theocratic chiefdoms. At least 2 of these evolved into the slave stage, namely on the islands of Pohnpei and Kosrae, which we'll go to later. Now the earliest contact with Europeans occurred in AD 1521 when Ferdinand Magellan routed the Cape of South America and reached the Marianas. Now the Federated States of Micronesia, or FSM, is in the western Pacific Ocean, as you can see, and it's composed of more than 600 islets and islands in the Caroline Islands archipelago. From west to east it is divided along cultural and linguistic lines into 4 states: Yap, Chuk, or what used to be called Truk, Pohnpei, and Kosrae. The FSM capital is Palakir on the island of Pohnpei. Both Pohnpei and Kosrae reached the slave stage of sociocultural evolutionary levels before white contact. Now to the west of the FSM lies the Republic of Palau, also in the Caroline Archipelago, and to the east is the Republic of the Marshall Islands. These two countries, together with the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands and the Federated States of Micronesia, were administered by the United States as the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands from 1947 to 1986. To the east of the FSM, Palau Republic and the Marshall's Republic are the U.S. territories of Guam, Wake Island, and Northern Marianas. So, we have revisited these definitions, and you can see them in space as well as in our discussion of the time. Now, in terms of geology, the geology of Micronesia is complex, comprises 6 distinct geologic units. These vary in age from about 97 million years ago in the Marshall Islands, which are the oldest Carol atolls on Earth, to the 25 million year old volcanic islands in the Northern Marianas. Yap was formed from upraised continental crust. Now, what's called the IBM Arc System, that stands for the Izu-Bonin-Mariana Arc System, is a tectonic plate convergent boundary. The IBM Arc System extends over 1,680 miles south from Tokyo, Japan to beyond Guam. It includes the Izu Islands, the Bonin Islands, and the Mariana Islands. Most of the IBM are systems submerged below sea level. The IBM Arc System lies along the eastern margin of the Philippine Sea Plate in the western Pacific Ocean. It is most famous for being the site of the deepest gash in Earth's solid surface, the Challenger Deep in the Mariana Trench. The IBM Arc System formed as a result of subduction of the western Pacific Plate. The IBM Arc System now subducts the Middle Jurassic to early Cretaceous lithosphere, with younger lithosphere in the north and the older lithosphere in the south. Its 170 million year old oceanic crust is the world's oldest oceanic crust. Subduction rates vary from 1 inch per year in the south to 2.5 inches in the north. Now, the volcanic islands that comprise these inland arcs were formed from the release of volatile steam from trapped water and other gases being released from the subducted plate. The associated trenches were formed as the oldest, most western part of the Pacific Plate crust increased in density with age. Now, this process finally reached its lowest point just as it went under the crust to the west of it. The IBM Arc System is an excellent example of an intraoceanic convergent margin, IOCM as it's called in geology. IOCMs are built on oceanic crust and contrast fundamentally with island arcs built on continental crust, such as Japan or the Indies. Because IOCM crust is thinner, denser, and more refractory than that beneath Indian-type margins, the study of IOCM melts and fluids allows more confident assessment of mantle-to-crust fluxes and processes that is possible for the Andean type of convergent margins. Because IOCMs are far removed from continents, the large volume of alluvial and glacial sediments does not affect them. The consequent thin sedimentary cover makes it much easier to study arc infrastructure and determine the mass and composition of subducted sediments. Active hydrothermal systems found on the submarine parts of the IOCMs give us a chance to study how many of Earth's important ore deposits formed. Now, moving on to the anthropology, the primitive communism and simple chiefdoms. Now, the majority of archaeological work in Micronesia has occurred since 1978. That work proves that prehistoric communist or simple chiefdom peoples moved into this area from 2 separate areas, firstly from insular Southeast Asia, and secondly from eastern Melanesia. The high islands of western Micronesia were settled by at least 4,000 years ago. Settlement in eastern Micronesia occurred by at least 2,000 years ago. Atolls are important sources of archaeological materials and figure prominently in the prehistory of the area. And now we want to go to the advanced theocratic chiefdoms and slave stage kingdoms which evolved there autochthonously. On the high islands, advanced theocratic chiefdom stage societies evolved autochthonously, and each had distinctive material remains. Some of these evolved into class-divided and state-organized servitude epic societies. The Mariana Islands. Evidence from sites such as the Taragay Beach on Guam and Achugao Point, Chalan Piao, and Lau Lau on Saipan show that the settlement of the Marianas occurred by 3,500 BP, years ago. Genetic evidence indicates that the Marianas and Yap were settled from islands in Southeast Asia via Central Eastern Micronesia. Now, if this is correct, and the Marianas were settled from some part of Southeast Asia, then Yap and Palau could have been stepping stones to the northern reaches of Western Micronesia. Now, in terms of archaeological evidence, the ceramics are important. And we want to take a look at the early and later ceramics. One type of ceramic ware is found in the earliest occupation layers in the Marianas, known as Achugao incised and San Roque incised. Another set of pottery traditions is dated later in Micronesian sites, and some of these later ones have decorative techniques reminiscent of the dentate stamped lapita pottery we discussed already with regard to Melanesia. Now, they are found also in western Polynesia. Achugao pottery has parallel incised lines in curved or rectilinear patterns around the necks of vessels with stamped or incised circle motifs with colored slips, usually in red or black. Decoration on the much rarer San Roque pottery consists of circular motifs. Lime was used to fill in the decoration on both of these ceramic types after firing. Pottery seen in the Marianas, as well as those ceramics from Luzon in the northern Philippines and Lapita, share similarities with the red slipped pottery found in Yuanshan assemblages in Taiwan. And there are other artifacts in addition to pottery in the Marianas, including beads and bracelets made from Kona's shell. Now, there are latte architectural features I want to bring to your attention. By AD 1000, we find some diagnostic features in Marianas prehistory called latte, that is L-A-T-T-E, latte stones. These are made from limestone, sandstone, or basalt. These are house-supporting stone pillars with capstones, called tassa, T-A-S-A, and were arranged in pairs numbering between 3 and 7, often occurring in clusters as they supported a variety of different homes. A study of 234 sets of latte on Guam shows that over 80% were in sets of 4 or 5 and were rarely more than 11 feet high. The House of Taga site on Tinian, however, has columns over 15 feet high. Latte stones served multiple purposes centering on habitation, domestic activities, and the prevention of rat access to food supplies. The carving, transport, and placing of latte stones proved rising Marianas' social complexity and had to have been accompanied by mythology central to the tribe and the chieftain. Now we move to the Western Caroline Islands. At 4500 BP, there are paleo-environmental cores showing an increase in charcoal fragments from people burning forested areas for growing crops and pollen from plants transported by humans. From 3300 to 3000 BP, archaeological data prove human occupation of Koror, that's K-O-R-O-R, the large volcanic islands of Battledaub, that's B-A-B-E-L-D-A-O-B, and the smaller rock islands of Palau. These are contemporaneous with the earliest prehistoric sites known in the Marianas. From 3000 to 2800 BP, there is good evidence for this period of occupation from Oolong Island and Chelachoy Rock, with the oldest burials in the Pacific Islands. Now, on Palau and Yap. Palauans have genetic contributions from Southeast Asia, Central Eastern Micronesia, and New Guinea. This is a reflection of their long history and geographical proximity to all three regions. Computer simulations of drift voyaging and linguistic data suggest that peoples from the southern Philippines colonized Palau. Because of its ecological diversity, Palau has a number of species not found in the other islands, such as the marine crocodile. Now, that's one of the most vicious animals out there, which even the natives are scared to death of. Among larger marine vertebrates, the now endangered dugong, was highly prized for its vertebrae, which were worn as bracelets on the clit by men of high rank in Palauan ATC society. Palauans and Yapese came with many important crops including taro, yams, and nuts. Swamp taro, that is Certosperma chamasonis, was grown in swamp ponds. The Yaps grew yams in gardens after slashing and burning sections of the forest, and in addition to the various plants that Western Carolinian populations purposely brought with them for food, were other cultigens including nuts from the betel palm, Areca catichu. This is chewed in combination with pepper leaf, piper betel, and slaked lime to produce a calming, euphoric effect in the user. Areca palms are an important cash crop today in Palau and Yap, and are often found surrounding men's houses or residences. Evidence for betel nut chewing in Palau dates back nearly 3,000 years. The initial colonizers of Palau probably focused on settling the larger islands of Battledaub and Koror, although the smaller rock islands were used for burying the dead. By about 2,500 years BP, people in Palau began constructing advanced theocratic chiefdom monumental earthworks along ridge lines such as terraces. Later, these become flat-topped crown and brim formations not found elsewhere in the Pacific Islands. After 1500 BP, most terraces were completely abandoned and are replaced by stonework villages on both the coralline and volcanic islands. By 800 BP, Palauan society had evolved to the ATC stage and was centered in villages with a considerable variety of stone architecture, and this includes house and cooking platforms, meeting house foundations, called bai foundations, docks, bathing areas, and chiefly backrests. Extensive pathways link sections of these villages together. Not only were these stone constructions utilitarian and defensive, but platforms were used for interring the dead. Since these ATCs are by definition socially ranked societies, the platforms also functions as indicators of status, rank, and power. When Europeans arrived, these villages had been continuously occupied from prehistoric times, and they continue today as places of residence for many inhabitants. Artifacts commonly found in stonework villages and at other archaeological sites in Palau include ceramics that were locally made and primarily tempered with grog, that is, crushed fragments of fired pottery. Some earlier samples contain calcareous or volcanic sand. Ornaments and tools are still made from the giant clam terebra and conus, as are a few stone tools. Archaeological research in Yap began in the 1950s and identified many superficial features of stone construction for house platforms, alignments, pathways, and walls. The earliest radiocarbon dates for Yap are 2200 to 2000 BP and come from the sites of Pemrang and Rungru at the southern end of Yap proper. Similar to many other Micronesian islands, the ubiquitous artifacts found in Yap are ceramic. However, there are others made from shell and stone. Now, the earliest ceramics contained what's called calcareous, sand-tempered, or CST pottery, and after about 600 BP, a laminated type of pottery becomes more common. However, like the Marianas and Palau, paleo-environmental sequences with charcoal and pollen suggest that initial settlement may have occurred by 1600 BP. Genetically, the Yap Islands appear to have been settled from Southeast Asia. The distribution of a particular genetic sequence on Yap and throughout central eastern Micronesia suggests that these areas were linked culturally in the past. The extensive exchange relations that were known historically between Yap and the coral atoll dwellers to the east are also evident. When Europeans arrived, there were people living in over 140 villages on the four main islands of Yap. Those islands were Yap, Map, Ramun, and Gagal Tamil. These were all socially ranked ATCs. Higher ranked villages were located on the coast, and lower ranked ones were inland. As a result, the higher the ranking, the more privileged access these groups had to resources from the land and sea. These ATC's status changed as conflicts occurred. Now, some of the most dominant features of Yapisi settlement are the Falu, that's the young men's house, the Pebe or council house, stone paths, and taro gardens. Villages are divided into tabana or plots, and often are surrounded by hedges. One bay, or paved plazas, are built on top of these. Other obvious markers of village life in Yap include their famous stone money, Rai, R-A-I, that can be seen lined up along pathways or in front of residences. These unusual discs are usually circular or ovoid in shape and made from limestone quarried in the rock islands of Palau. It has been proposed that populations grew to as many as 30,000 people by 1850. The Yapese taro agriculture spread from small-scale cultivation of crops on hillsides to the coastal areas, and according to the Japanese administration census of 1900, their numbers declined rapidly after contact to less than 8,000. Now we're going to move to the Central and Eastern Caroline Islands. By 2000 BP, the islands of Chuck, or what used to be Truk, Pohnpei, and Kosrae have been colonized from southeast Melanesia. And I think we're going to stop here and we're going to take a look at the map which shows us Kosrae and Pohnpei in particular. So by 2000 BP, the islands of Chuck or Truk, Pohnpei, and Kosrae had been colonized from southeast Melanesia. And you can see all of those on this particular map here. The languages of these islands are a subgroup of Oceanian languages called Nuclear Micronesian. The initial settlers of these islands came therefore from the early Lapita expansion between the Bismarcks, the Solomons, and Vanuatu. All of the high islands in the Central and Eastern Carolines had calcareous and tempered, that is CST pottery, during their initial colonization at 2000 BP. However, the manufacturing of pottery ceases on all these islands about 700 BP. Now, why people here and in other parts of the Pacific stopped making pottery remains unresolved, but they still had need for containers, and so these would have been made from something, and this is something that archaeology will have to focus on in the future. For subsistence, those islands around the central part of Micronesia, such as Chuck, tend to rely on taro, but also breadfruit that is seasonally available, and I'm going to go through the most important plants toward the end of this lecture. Now, the pepper plant, Piper methisticum, known as kava, K-A-V-A in Polynesia, was brought into Pohnpei and Kosrae, where it is known as sekau and sika, respectively. The roots of this pepper plant were pounded into a pulp on a large basalt sekau stone. That's spelled S-E-K-A-U, sekau stone. These stones are found in prehistoric and modern villages. To prepare it for drinking, the pulp is strained with water by twisting it through the inner strips of bark from the hibiscus tree. Users share the sebau sekau in a communal cup, which numbs the mouth, relaxes the individual, and heightens senses. Pohnpei is the third largest island in Micronesia at 330 square kilometers. It was originally settled by peoples by 3000 BP, and this is earlier than older chronologies that made its occupation consistent with Chuck and Kosrae at 2000 BP. So, at given time, archaeology has pushed the date back 1,000 years. Now we want to take a look at Kosrae and Tonga from ATCs to slave stage kingdoms. Whether slave stage kingdoms arose in Melanesia for one or more of its many ATCs is unclear to me. However, at Pohnpei and Kosrae in Micronesia and at Tonga in Polynesia, there is unequivocal archaeological evidence for the emergence of the slave stage in the form of kingdoms from that of the advanced theocratic chiefdoms in Oceania. The most common types of archaeological sites found on Pohnpei and Kosrae are those with stone architecture. Now, to put it in perspective, the air travel distance between Pohnpei and Kosrae is 342 miles. Now, Pohnpei, primitive communism to simple chiefdom, and ATC to kingdom. Pohnpei is an island in the FSM, that is the Federated States of Micronesia, in the western Pacific Ocean. It has reefs and a mountainous jungle-covered interior. The Kipiroi waterfall tumbles over large rocks, so you can see it has a water of its own. The earliest settlers were probably Lapita culture people from the southeast Solomon Islands or the Vanuatu archipelago. Their prehistory after primitive communism grades into history, and I periodize the continuum into 3 eras. First, the period of building or peopling, which occurs before AD 1100. Pohnpeian oral history says that the Sandalur rulers, or the Saudalir rulers, were the first to bring class-divided, state-organized government to Pohnpei, and that they were of foreign origin. These original founders of the dynasty are then said to have ruled kindly, though their successors placed increasingly heavy demands on their subjects. Thus, Saudalir rule became increasingly oppressive over several generations. These arbitrary and onerous demands, combined with the disdain of the Saudalir priests for traditional Pohnpeian deities, created resentment among native Pohnpeians. Then secondly, the period of the Lord of Deleur, that is D-E-L-E-U-R, from AD 1100 to AD 1628. In AD 1500, oral history says an invading group overthrew the Saudalir rulers. A man called Iso Kelikal led these invaders. He used 333 warriors, according to this story, in the battle that defeated the ruling classes and ended the Saudalir dynasty. Iso Kelikal took up residence at Nan Madol on the east coast. I wish I had gotten some pictures of this for you, but at any rate, if you look on the internet for Nan Madol, that's spelled N-A-N-M-A-D-O-L, you're going to see what is really a huge castle-like structure. His successors, well, at any rate, he overthrew the Saudalir dynasty and took up residence at Nan Madol. His successors abandoned the city. Its ancient ruins include basalt temples and burial vaults. And then we come finally to the period of Namwarki, that is from AD 1628 to AD 1885. European chroniclers of colonial times used terms for the social structure of Micronesian islands that reflected their prejudice that these natives were too primitive to enjoy the delights of European feudal class structure. Now, scientific ethnography of modern times has adopted the ideas of chiefs and chiefdom structure without considering the utility of slave and feudal stage Western and Eastern servitude epic classification. So, however, for our purposes, it's useful to read the data and periodize accordingly as follows. At the time of white contact, the Pohnpeian kingdom was composed of 5 dukedoms with various princes and princelings. This hierarchy ruled over the mass of commoner, farmer, mariners. 2 principal nobles headed each of the 5 dukedoms. Now there were 2 dukes, in other words, for each of them. Now all land belonged to these nobles who received regular tribute and whose rule was absolute. Punishments administered by the dukes included death and banishment. Inter-dukedom wars featured looting, destruction of houses and canoes, and killing of prisoners. Taking a look at the archaeology specifically, in the year AD 1 we have the earliest settlement on Pohnpei. It begins with the radiocarbon dating of human, and then with the radiocarbon human dating starting AD 80 to 200. Nan Madol lies between the main island of Pohnpei and Temwen Island. Human activity there began as early as this 1st century AD. By the AD 700s, islet construction had begun. That is, building their own artificial islands, kind of like the Mexicans did in what's now Mexico City, Tenochtitlan. In AD 1180, ATC megalithic construction began at Nan Madol when large basalt stones were quarried from a volcanic plug on the opposite side of Pohnpei. Until AD 1628, Nan Beidal was ceremonial and the political seat of the Sadalir kingdom that encompassed Pohnpei's 25,000 people and the nearby islands. The Nan Beidal Archaeological District today covers more than 18 square kilometers. It includes stone architecture built up on a coral reef flat that runs along the shore of Tam Wen Island, several other artificial islets, and the adjacent Pohnpei Island coastline. Its stone walls include an area 1 mile long by a third of a mile wide, containing nearly 100 artificial stone and coral-filled platform islets and bordered by tidal canals. The city of Nan Madol is on the eastern shore of the island of Pohnpei. It was the capital of the Sadalir dynasty until AD 1628, and it is in the present day in the Mandalim district of Pohnpei State in the Federated States of Micronesia. The city, constructed in a lagoon, consisted of a series of small artificial islands linked by a network of canals. As an archaeological site, its core has stone walls enclosing an area 1 mile long by a third of a mile wide, and as we have seen, its 100 acres contain 100 artificial stone and coral-filled islet platforms bordered by tidal canals. Its construction featured large foundation boulders supporting basalt columns. It is by far the most impressive example of stonework in Micronesia and represents one of the finest examples of architectural excellence in prehistoric Oceania. Nan Madol contained dozens of structures including stone enclosures, platforms, and tubes. It is called the Venice of the Pacific because its channels can be accessed by boat during higher tides. In AD 400, construction began in Nan Madol and lasted for nearly 1,000 years. It was an advanced theocratic chiefdom to start when the most intensive building took place and began during the last few hundred years of its use. Now, these structures began as residences for the island's elite ruling class of the Sadalir kingdom after the transition to the slave stage. Nan Madol was the ceremonial and political seat of the Sadalir dynasty, which united Pohnpei's Nandawas, where walls 18 to 25 feet high surround a central tomb enclosure within the main courtyard. This was built for the first Sadalir king. On Nan Madol there was no fresh water or food resources other than the sea. Therefore, water had to be collected on Pohnpei and agricultural food grown inland on various islands. During Sadalir rule, Pohnpeians brought essential food and water by boat. The Sadalir kingdom received food at a particular islet first at Penio and later the closer Yusanong. By AD 1628, after Isokilekal had overthrown the Sadalurs and began the Namwarki era, the Namwarkis lived at Nan Madol, but they had to gather their own water and grow their own food. Efficiency and plentiful unfree labor allowed them to abandon Nan Madol and move back to Pohnpei. Now, from Nan Madol, capital city of Pohnpei Kingdom, to Leilu, capital city of the Khosrei Kingdom. Radiocarbon dating shows us that the builders of the Nan Madol capital of the kingdom that ruled Pohnpei were later sent to build Leilu on Khosrei Island when it became a kingdom. The Leilu Elite Center was a special place of residence for the nobility and of mortuary activity presided over by priests. Its population was about 1,000. Dukes, princes, and their retainers were primary residents. The others were commoners brought in to serve the ruling classes. My guess is that the Leilu capital served the same functions as the Nan Madol capital city did for the Pohnpei kingdom. At Nan Madol, the city was a place to concentrate the boss hierarchy. This is an old story, as we've seen throughout these volumes. Keeping control over the necessary boss hierarchy was essential in all slave and feudal societies. In Pohnpei, it was necessary for the ruling Sadalirs to organize and control their hierarchy bosses too, by requiring them to live in the city rather than in their home districts where their activities would have been more difficult to monitor, and to encourage high living to keep the financial resources out of the hands of that hierarchy. Furthermore, now monumental architecture was another way to keep labor power out of the hands of those who inevitably would use it, if they could, use it as their own profit centers and thereby have the money to pay the thuggery they would need to seize more islands and more revenue. A direct correlation with the way the Egyptian pyramids were built for the exact same reason, to keep that labor power busy and out of the hands of the gnome bosses. Now, the dwellings of priests once occupied most islets. Some islets served a special purpose: food preparation, canoe construction on Dapahu, and coconut oil preparation on Piniring. Medalpau, the mortuary sector, contains 58 islets in the northeastern area of Nan Madol. High walls surrounding the tombs are located on Panakaitel, Carrion, and Lemon Ku. The most prominent is the Royal Mortuary Islet of Nanda Was, where walls 18 to 25 feet high surround a central tomb enclosure within the main courtyard. This, as I had said, was built for the first Sadalir king. Now, the Khosrei ATC evolves into a slave stage kingdom. Before 2500 BP, paleoenvironmental data shows the colonization of Khosrei. It was contemporaneous with colonization of other islands in the central and eastern Carolines. During the first millennium AD, Lelu Island was settled. In AD 1250, the capital city of Khosrei Kingdom was located on Lelu Island. As we would expect, given the overseeing of Lelu's builders by architects from Pohnpei Kingdom, it is similar to Nan Madol. It was constructed using columnar basalt columns to form walls and foundations. The site covers an area of 45 acres, with a canal running through the center of the site to allow access to the sea. At maximum, it had a population of about 1,500 and covered over 34 acres. Lelu was the first residence of the ATC chief and his administrators. Pottery recovered here is similar to late Lapita plainware, but shares close affinity with pottery from Chuck. Later, after Khosrei evolved into the slave stage, Lelu was the residence of the king et al., and it featured burial pyramids for the nobility. From 800 to 300 BP, the population increased with an intensive settlement of the coastal margins and upper valleys. During the century 600 to 500 BP, nearly all of the major land areas, including the coastlines, flatter uplands, and mangrove islands, were occupied. Lelu is an archaeological site today, and it encompasses the remains of the capital city of Khosrei Kingdom on Lelu Island. These remains are from that kingdom that peaked from AD 1300 to 1400, and its ruins were visible at the time of European contact 400 years later in the early 1800s. The rulers of Lelu conquered and unified the island of Khosrei. Lelu became the capital city of the Khosrei Kingdom. The kings of Khosrei were monarchs similar to those that ruled the kingdoms of Tonga and Hawaii, which we're going to get to in future lectures. The city itself is built of blocks of coral and basalt. Khosrei had a highly stratified society, typical of the surrounding islands of the time. It consists of housing, royal tombs, and sacred spaces. Housing concentrated the king, his family, the high and low nobility that served as the boss hierarchy over the commoner population. The materials used for the construction of housing depended on social class, as did the spatial situation of hierarchy. In the center lived the king and the aristocracy behind high walls of basalt, similar to those of Nan Madol to the west. Then there was a ring of less conspicuous housing for the lower aristocracy made of coral, and the rest of the free population lived in simple huts. Its cultural features included matrilineage and clans, with a servitude epic social structure of nobles controlling land worked by unfree commoners. These unfree farmer mariners lived in settlements consisting of small groups of close relatives sharing a single cookhouse. At the time of white contact, the population was between 7,000 and 10,000 people and declined rapidly thereafter. Only a few hundred people were left alive on Khosrei in the 1870s. Rewards of white contact. On the 15th of September 1529, the Spanish navigator Alvaro de Saavedra recorded the sighting of Leilu, becoming the first European to do so. Saavedra was trying to return from Tidore in the Molucca Islands of eastern Indonesia, heading for New Spain, that is Mexico. In 1852, the first missionary post was established by Congregationalists. Virtually the whole island converted to their version of Christianity, and Cosray's population was rewarded with extermination. It dropped to 200 by 1870. On 15 March 1874, the notorious blackbirder Captain Bully Hayes was shipwrecked on Cosray when his ship, the Leonora, was caught in Otway Harbor during a storm. Bully Hayes made his home in Otway for 7 months, during which time he terrorized the local people, raping women and pillaging villages. In September 1874, Captain Dupuy of the HMS Rosario, who was hot on the tail of Bully Hayes, wanted for multiple offenses, including piracy, arrived to grab and hang him. Hayes was arrested. However, Hayes had anticipated this possibility and built a 14-foot boat from timber salvaged from the shipwrecked Leonora, and he escaped one step ahead of this maritime sheriff. Rumor had it, as it always does in these cases, that his treasure had been left behind, as unlikely as that seems. Some said it was buried somewhere in the forest, although subsequent diggings have failed to uncover it. The existence of this buried body is part of the mythology surrounding the buccaneering blackbirder Hayes. In 1885, after a dispute between the Spanish Empire and the German Empire, finally resolved under the terms of the Vatican State, the Spanish Navy took effective control of the island. After the Spanish defeat against the United States in the War of 1898, on February 2, 1899, Spain sold the Carolina Islands to Germany for 25 million pesetas, which was 17 million German marks, and the island came under the control of the Empire of Japan after World War I. Now, on Pfeffan Island, F-E-F-A-N, in Chuck. Of the 3 highland islands in this region of Micronesia, Chuck, formerly known as Truk, has received the least attention archaeologically. However, it does have some of the best evidence for historic sites dating to the Japanese administrative period and World War II. At 2000 BP, we have the earliest dates for the settlement of Chuck on the island of Phi-Phan. However, the initial human occupation would have been earlier. Afterwards, the cultural chronology for Chuck has a long gap of 1,000 years between 1500 and 700 BP, where little information exists. Some archaeological deposits found within the intertidal zone off Phi-Phan show that stilt houses were built. In the Winas, W-I-N-A-S, phase probably represents the initial settlement of Chuck Lagoon, and the sites on Phi-Phan Island contain the oldest pottery-bearing sites in central and eastern Micronesia. Ceramic vessels are typical calcareous, sand-tempered, or CST plain bowls or pots with little to no decoration. Tridacna shell tools and conus ornaments are found reminiscent of those seen in the Solomon Islands. The later Tonopah phase lasts from 700 BP to the present, and no ceramics are present, but a number of other artifacts are found, such as coral pounders, terebra shell adzes, and breadfruit peelers made from cowrie shells, that's Cyprea bonetta shells. Archaeologists have identified 7 major site types on the island. Most are associated with later periods of occupation, and these include coastal residences with lineage houses called wuteches, coastal wuts or canoe houses, interior residences that were domestic in nature, interior fanang or cookhouses, ridge and summit sites that are midden-rich, rock art, and forts with rock wall structures located at higher elevations. And we move to the Marshall Islands, which are the best known, having been used as atomic testing grounds by the U.S. military after World War II. In total, 67 hydrogen bombs were detonated between 1946 and 1958. That would be atomic and hydrogen bombs, all of which took place on either Bikini or in Inawitak Atoll. Good evidence is emerging for intensive prehistoric occupation, however. Radiocarbon dates from Bikini run between 3500 to 2800 BP. Otherwise, early settlement of the Marshalls dates to 2000 BP on several atolls including Kwajalein, Bikini, and Majuro. Linguistic evidence indicates that groups originating in eastern Melanesia colonized the Marshalls. However, it is possible that people moved northward through Tuvalu and Kiribati from Fiji. Now, although atolls are rich in marine foods, prehistoric Marshall Islanders cultivated crops in order to survive on these small, remote islands. Differences in rainfall between the northern and southern Marshall Islands led to the giant swamp taro, Crystosperma, and breadfruit being emphasized in the more southerly and wet islands, and coconut and pandanus in the northern and more arid islands. Artifacts found in Marshall sites were made from bone and shell due to the lack of local volcanic stone. These include shell adzes made from cassis, conas, lambas, tridacna, spondylus beads, and conus rings. Pearl shell was also used to manufacture trolling lures and fish hooks. The few stone artifacts found in archaeological deposits may have been made from stone that drifted to the islands on driftwood masses. 29 burials at Laura village on Majuro that date to 1400 to 1800 years BP and contain hundreds of ornaments such as beads, shell rings, and a few bone and shell tools testify to inhabitants caring for the deceased during the early prehistoric period. And then we come to Kiribati. That's Kiribati. Since 1980, there has been a steady increase in archaeological investigation on Kiribati. Linguistically, people in Kiribati, as in the central and eastern Carolines, speak the languages of nuclear Micronesia. A majority of the archaeological work conducted on prehistoric settlement in Kiribati has been done in the Gilberts. Some of these islands, especially Tarawa, were the scenes of incredible bloodshed as U.S. Marines stormed heavily dug-in Japanese infantry. Excavations on the island of Macon by Japanese archaeologists revealed cultural deposits at a depth of over 10 feet that date to around 1600 BP. The artifacts found, including fishing lures made from cassis shell, are closely related to those found in eastern Polynesia. Studies conducted later on the islands of Tarawa and Tamana revealed a diversity of fishing gear such as fishhooks and lure shacks, shell beads, and pavement and alignments made from coral rock. More recent archaeological work on Nikunau shows that prehistoric people were building earth ovens using coral and clam shells. And now I'm going to make a few comments on the most important domesticated plants of this area, beginning with breadfruit, or Artocarpus altilis, which is a species of flowering tree in the mulberry and jackfruit family, Moraceae, originating in the South Pacific. It spread from New Guinea to western Micronesia and then to the rest of Oceania. DNA fingerprinting traces breadfruit origins in the region of Oceania from New Guinea to western Micronesia. Its name is derived from the texture of the moderately ripe fruit when cooked that is similar to freshly baked bread. It has a potato flavor. In addition to the fruit serving as a staple food, the tree's light, sturdy timber was used for outriggers, ships, and houses. Then we come to the swamp taro. The Certosperma mercusi, or giant swamp taro, is a crop grown throughout Oceania and South and Southeast Asia. It is a river and swamp crop similar to taro, but with bigger leaves and larger, coarser roots. There are no wild populations today. It was native to Indonesia. It is known as Puraka in the Cook Islands, Lac in Yap of the FSM, Babai in Kiribati, Pula in Samoa, Viacan in Fiji, Pulaka in Tokelau and Tuvalu, Simadan in Chuuk, swamp taro in Papua New Guinea, Navia in Vanuatu, and Palawan in the Philippines. The same species is also known by the names Certosperma lacioides and Certosperma chamasonis and Certosperma edule. Now, in the harsh atoll environments of the Central Pacific, especially Tuvalu and Kiribati, Swamp taro is an important source of carbohydrates in a diet otherwise dominated by fish and coconut. Its cultivation is difficult and time-consuming. The roots are cooked for hours to reduce toxicity in the corms. They are rich in nutrients, especially calcium. The cultivation of pulaki in Tuvalu and babai in Kiribati is an important cultural and culinary tradition now under threat from a rising sea level and displacement from the growing use of imported food products. Giant swamp taro is the largest of the root crop plants known collectively as taro that are cultivated throughout Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Although outwardly similar to Colocasia esculenta, the most widely cultivated taro, it belongs to a different genus. The plant may reach heights of 12 to 20 feet, with leaves and roots much larger than Colocasia esculenta. The sagittate leaves are up to 6 feet 7 inches long and up to 4 feet in width, and are borne atop petioles or stalks that are up to 19 feet 6 inches long and 4 inches wide. This taro species is resistant to disease and pests, but it is susceptible to the taro beetle. The corm, which can weigh as much as 100 kilograms or 220 pounds, with a diameter of up to 39 inches and equally long, it is starchy and cream or pink in color, with a taste similar to sweet potato, though it is drier in texture. Giant swamp taro is not suitable for growing in uplands or rain. It is mildly tolerant of saline growing conditions compared to other taro species and can be grown in mildly brackish water. It is nearly the only carbohydrate crop that can be cultivated on low-lying coral atolls. There it is grown in swamp pits dug to below the level of the freshwater lens. In these harsh environments, its cultivation is increasingly threatened by rising sea levels caused by global warming because while it is mildly tolerant, it does not thrive in brackish water. Such water rots the roots, turning the leaves yellow, and stunts the growth of the plant. Climate change is affecting its cultivation when more frequent droughts increase the salinity of the freshwater lens, and when more extreme high tides and coastal erosion lead to saltwater intrusions into the cultivation pits. It is a slow-growing crop, taking up to 15 years to mature. Giant swamp taro contain toxins that must be removed by long cooking. It may be field stored in the ground for very long periods of 30 years or even more. It is an important emergency crop in times of natural disaster and food scarcity. The cooked corms can be dried in the sun and stored for later use. And different methods of preparation are used for pulaki in Tuvalu and bebai in Kiribati. And finally we come to the yams. The yam crops are started when the whole seed tubers or tuber portions are planted into mounds or ridges at the beginning of the rainy season. The crop yield depends on how and where the sets are planted, the sizes of the mounds, the interplant spacing, the provision of stakes for the resultant plants, yam species, and tuber sizes desired at harvest. Small-scale farmers in West and Central Africa often intercrop yams with cereals and vegetables. But in Oceania, the seed yams are perishable and bulky to transport. Farmers who do not buy new seed yams and usually set up to 30% of their harvest for the planting of the next year. Yam crops face pressure from a range of insect pests and fungal and viral diseases, as well as the nematode. Their growth and dormant phases correspond respectively to the wet season and the dry season. For maximum yield, the yams require a humid tropical environment with an annual rainfall over 1,500 millimeters, distributed uniformly throughout the growing season. White, yellow, and water yams typically produce a single large tuber per year, generally weighing 11 to 22 pounds. Many cultivars of yams occur throughout the humid tropics. Dioscorea rotundata, the white yam, and Dioscorea cayennensis, the yellow yam, are the most important cultivated yams in Oceania. Over 200 varieties between them are cultivated. White yam tuber is roughly cylindrical in shape, the skin is smooth and brown, and the flesh is usually white and firm. Yellow yam has yellow flesh caused by the presence of carotenoids. It looks similar to the white yam in outer appearance. Its tuber skin is usually a bit firmer and less extensively grooved. The yellow yam has a longer period of vegetation and a shorter dormancy than white yam. The Kokoro variety is important in making dried yam chips. Now there are large plants. These are, the vines can be as long as 10 to 12 meters, that is 33 to 39 feet. The tubers most often weigh about 5.5 to 11 pounds each, but can weigh as much as 55 pounds. D. alata, called winged yam, water yam, and purple yam, was first cultivated in Southeast Asia, although not grown in the same quantities as the yellow and white yams. Alata has the largest distribution worldwide of any cultivated yam, being grown in Asia, the Pacific Islands, Africa, and the West Indies. The tuber shape is generally cylindrical, but can vary. Tuber flesh is white and watery in texture. Uhi, that is UHI, was brought to Hawaii by early Polynesian settlers and became a major crop in the 1800s. When the tubers were sold to visiting ships as an easily stored food supply for their voyages, the natives found a new source of income. The Polystacia Chinese yam is native to China. The Chinese yam plant is somewhat smaller than the African, with the vines about 10 feet long. It is tolerant to frost and can be grown in much cooler conditions than other yams, so it is also grown in Korea and Japan. It was introduced to Europe in the 1800s when the potato crop there was falling victim to disease, and it is still grown in France for the Asian food market. The tubers are harvested after about 6 months of growth. Some are eaten right after harvesting, and some are used as ingredients for other dishes, including noodles and for traditional medicines. The D. bulbifera, the air potato, is found in Africa and Asia, with slight differences between those found in each place. It is a large vine, 20 feet or more in length. It produces tubers, but the bulbils that grow at the base of its leaves are the more important food product. They are about the size of potatoes, hence the name air potato, weighing from 1 to 4.5 pounds. Some varieties can be eaten raw, while some require soaking or boiling for detoxification before eating. It is not grown much commercially since most people prefer the flavor of other yams. However, it is popular in home vegetable gardens because it produces a crop after only 4 months of growth and continues producing for the life of the vine as long as 2 years. In addition, the bulbils are easy to harvest and cook. In 1905, the air potato was introduced to Florida and has since become an invasive species in much of the state. Its rapid growth crowds out native vegetation and is very difficult to remove since it can grow back from the tubers, and new vines can grow from the bulbils even after being cut down or burned. D. esculenta, the lesser yam, was one of the first yam species cultivated. It is native to Southeast Asia, and in the Pacific Islands, in Oceania, it is the third most commonly cultivated species, although it is cultivated very little in other parts of the world. Its vines seldom reach more than 10 feet in length, and the tubers are small in most varieties. These tubers are baked, boiled, or fried, much like potatoes. Because of the small size of tubers, mechanical cultivation is possible, which along with its easy preparation and good flavor could help the Yesser lamb become more popular in the future. The Dumatorum form, the bitter yam, is popular as a vegetable in parts of West Africa, in part because their cultivation requires less labor than other yams. The wild forms are toxic and are used to poison animals when mixed with bait, and were subsequently introduced into Oceania. The Triphyta kush yam is native to the Guyana region of South America and is the most important cultivated New World yam. Since they originated in tropical rainforest conditions, their growth cycle is less related to seasonal changes than other yams. Because of their relative ease of cultivation and their good flavor, they are considered to have great potential for increased production. And finally, we come to the harvesting. Wood-based tools are preferred to metallic tools as they are less likely to damage the fragile tubers. However, wood tools need frequent replacement. Yam harvesting is labor-intensive and physically demanding. Tuber harvesting involves standing, bending, squatting, and sometimes sitting on the ground, depending the size of the mound, size of the tuber, or the depth of tuber penetration. Care must be taken to avoid damage to the tuber, because damaged tubers do not store well and spoil rapidly. Some farmers use staking and mixed cropping, a practice that complicates harvesting in some cases. In forested areas, tubers grow in areas where other tree roots are present. Harvesting the tuber then involves the additional step of freeing them from other roots. This often causes tuber damage. Aerial tubers or bulbils are harvested by manual plucking from the vine. Yields may improve and cost of yam production is lower if mechanization were to be developed and adopted. However, current crop production practices and species used pose considerable hurdles to successful mechanization of yam production, particularly for small-scale rural farmers. Extensive changes in traditional cultivation practices, such as mixed cropping, may be required. Modification of current tuber harvesting equipment is necessary given yam tuber architecture and its different physical properties. And for practical purposes, it's more likely that in Oceania, the populations there will move on to other sources of yams than themselves. And this brings us to a conclusion of this particular lecture on Micronesia. Next I'm going to move to Polynesia, and we'll stop right now.